All right, sixth graders, this is to help you with question 7 on CR number 4. It says the table shows the number of meters of butcher paper each 5th grade class used for a school project. So Mrs. Marquez, her class used 1.2 meters of paper. Mrs. James's class used 1.03 meters of paper. Mrs. Davis's class used 2 meters of paper. Mrs. Peters' class used 0.985 meters of paper. Mrs. Cantanella's class used 1.654 meters of paper. All right, you're going to notice I put a place value chart here because a lot of times when we work with decimals, it's just helpful to have a place value chart in front of us. We can always write our own place value chart in, but with decimals, it's really important that we know that 1.2 means 1 and 2/10. So I'm just going to write the numbers in for right now. Mrs. M's class would be 1 and 2/10. Mrs. James's class would be 1 and 3/100. So that means I need to end that in the hundredths place. Mrs. Davis's class is just 2. Use 2 meters, so that just ends in the ones place. Mrs. Peters' class is 985 thousandths, so it's 0.9 in the tenths place, 8 in the hundredths place, and a 5 in the thousandths place. It has to end in the thousandths. And again, if we want to make sure we're lining up our place values, you can always just extend these lines here. All right. And Mrs. Cantanella's class was 1 and 654 thousandths. 654 thousandths. It means my number needs to end in the thousandths place. All right. So I just wanted to make sure we reviewed all of these. How many more meters of butcher paper did Mrs. Davis's class use than Mrs. James's? Mrs. Davis's and Mrs. James's. Okay. So Mrs. Davis's used 2 meters. Mrs. James's class used 1 and 3/100 meters. So if we want to figure out how many more meters, that's a subtraction problem. We have to make sure we line up our place values. So we take Mrs. Davis's class, which is 2 meters, and we're going to subtract off for Mrs. James's class 1 and 3/100 meters. So I got to make sure my ones places are lined up, my decimal points are lined up. And that was 1 and 3/100 meters. Here's the deal. If we have 1 and 3/100 for our straight 2 meters, we should do 0 placeholders, so it also will end in the hundredths place. So our place values are all lined up. We're ready to subtract. Can I take 3 from 0? No. Ooh, so I'd have to borrow. Ooh, can't borrow there. Borrow here. So this 2 becomes a 1. That makes that a 10. Now I can borrow from here. So if I need to get a number way over here, I go to here. I say, oh, good, now there's 10 there. I can borrow, make that one a 9, make this one a 10. So I have 10 minus 3 is 7. Excuse me. Sorry about that. 9 minus 0 is 9. Place value, or decimal point, 1 minus 1 is 0. So 97/100 more. So 97/100 of a meter more. So Mrs. Davis's class used 97/100 of a meter more than Mrs. James's. Which class used the least amount of paper? I love that our decimals are already all lined up. I'm going to put zeros in as placeholders. Least amount of paper. Well, here's the dealio. All of these numbers have 1 point something, 2 point something, 1 point something. So as soon as I see a 0 in the ones place, that's definitely lower than 1 point something or 2 point something. So that one was pretty easy, I think. Yours might not be that straightforward. And then if, let's say, the ones place is matched, then you'd move to the tenths, the hundredths, the thousandths to see which is the smallest number. But I got off easy because already I can tell 0 point something is smaller than 2 or 1 point something. So which class is that? Mrs. Peters. Okay. How much less paper was used by Mrs. Marquez's class than Mrs. Cantanella's? Okay, so now I'm looking at Marquez's class and Cantanella's class. Okay. How much less paper? Again, this is going to be a subtraction. I wonder if on your CR it was, oops, sorry about that. Hold on one sec. I'm sorry about that. Whew. All right, so I wonder if on your CR there was lots of subtraction also. I don't know. So for this problem down here, it's going to be subtract. So I'm just going to cross off the rest of them. These are the two numbers. So we'll take Mrs. Cantanella's class, 1.654, and we'll subtract off how much Mrs. Marquez's class used, 1.200. When we subtract that off, we'll figure out how much less paper her class used than Mrs. Cantanella's. 4 minus 0 is 4, 5 minus 0 is 5, 6 minus 2 is 4, 1 minus 1 is 0. Excuse me. So her class used 0.454 meters less. Okay, hopefully that helps. So it's just a review with some decimals. Subtraction, you have to go ahead and make sure you line up your place values before you can subtract. I hope that helps.